Well, welcome everyone to the next series of Expert Dynamics and GP, our seminar on cycle count. My name is Chaz Van, and I'm a managing consultant here at ICE, and I'm going to be conducting the webinar today. Been in the industry for, almost 30 years now. Really, recently, a lot of my focus has been on logistics, supply chain, and most recently really focusing on customers as they're implementing the procurement solution to complement what we have in our Dynamics GP. This morning as we talk about cycle count, let's talk about why that is an important aspect of managing your business. When we think of our balance sheet and the assets that we hold on our balance sheet, oftentimes inventory is one of the largest assets we carry. So indeed, it is important that we maintain accurate inventory count. Within Dynamics GP, the stock count feature really does make it easy to accurately keep track of inventory. When we're conducting stock counts, we can create a stock count at any given time. We might have a need based upon what's going on that we need to initiate a stock count immediately for a particular site or item count. And then at times, we want to schedule periodic stock counts based upon some aspect of our inventory items, whether it's an ABC classification based upon the number of item turns, or some other reason why we need to create an item stock count. Really, using the stock count feature within Dynamics GP makes it easy that we don't have to shut down the operation in order to stock count. When we initiate a stock count, the system takes a snapshot of the balances at that given time. We'll conduct our physical inventory. Then we'll come back and enter our actual counts, do the variance, and we'll post an entry into inventory, as well as it will update what we have in general ledger. The stock count is initiated via the stock count entry window. Let me just minimize my PowerPoint for a moment. I'm going to open up Dynamics GP. On the inventory area pane is where I begin to initiate my stock count. Up in the upper right-hand corner, when I'm ready to create a stock count schedule, that's the window that I utilize. I'm going to initially start with a stock count that I already have created to go over the fields on the window, explain some of the processing, and then I'll actually create a new stock count schedule, and that will give you the opportunity to see how easy it is to actually initiate one. Recreate that a little bit later on. When I create a stock count, give it an ID. I would certainly like to give it something other than a generic demo, but I would want to give it an ID that gives me an indication of what I'm using the stock count for, give it some type of description, and then as I utilize and create a count, I'll notice that there are some fields that become available. The first one that jumps out is the status. The status of a stock count can consist of three entries, either available, started, or entered. So available would indicate this is the first time perhaps I've created the stock count, or I've saved the previously stock count and not started the count. And what it essentially means is this stock count is ready to be used. When I start a stock count, the status will change from available to started. So if someone else were to later come and look at the stock count schedule, they would see that the stock count is already in progress And perhaps that would be an indication to them that they don't want to start a new stock count at the time. Well, once I've created the stock count, started it, conducted my physical inventory, then I come back and I start entering my item count. The status will change from available to 3 quick, easily to understand statuses on a stock count. As I'm creating a stock count, you notice in the upper right-hand corner, I have a field called default site ID. So as I'm adding items to the stock count, perhaps I'm going to count in one specific location. Perhaps I'm going to add items to the stock count individually. So rather than having to select the site each time, I put in a default site ID. Each item that gets added to this stock count will be selected from that specific site. Right below that, you'll notice this reused stock count. So rather than just creating a stock count to be used one time, I may have a group of items at a given site that I want to conduct on a periodic basis. So by selecting the reused stock count, once I've counted these items, the stock count remains. So this is very similar to recurring batches in other parts of Dynamics GP. So again, this makes it very easy when I'm managing my stock count. The last used date, pretty explanatory, that after I've conducted a stock count and I'm coming back later on and I want to know when the last time the stock count was utilized, the last used date represents when the last stock count was processed. To make it easy, or when I'm coming back to enter my count values, I can sort the scrolling area below by a variety of criteria. I can sort it by site. I'm using more than one site on this particular stock count. Item number, description, or next count date. Again, all of that is geared towards making the stock count easier to use. In this scrolling area, I can individually add items to be counted. If I have a one-time, something very specific, I can add individual items to it. And when I select an item, if I haven't chosen the default site ID, then I would need to choose a site ID. The unit of measure will default. The next count date, last count date, all of those entries will default. But more often than not, rather than going through individually and selecting items, I'd like to utilize a feature called Mass Add. The Mass Add feature allows me to do quickly add items to my stock count. So I can add items based upon a range, site ID. I'm going to select all the items in a given site. Or maybe I've classified my inventory by ABC code. I can choose an ABC code. One that's often utilized is item class or item type or next count date. By utilizing the range, I can quickly select items to be added and certainly create a stock count that's easy to use. And as I mentioned, I'm going to come back and actually show that. I just want to go through the field initially. Once I've chosen my stock count, added my item, and the next step is simply to actually start my count. Starting the count actually does a couple of things. What it does is it captures a snapshot of the inventory as it existed the time I began the count. So therefore, when I come back later on and I'm entering my counted quantities, it's on what the stock count was at that given time. And then it also sets the stock count start date and start time to the user date and system time. So that gives me the opportunity to initiate my stock count. What the system will do at that point, it wants to make sure that this is going to be a valid stock count that can be processed successfully. So when I start the count, it will check to make sure there are no exceptions. So an exception might be that there's already a stock count in progress that has this particular item site combination. The system will verify that before it lets me successfully start the count. And then last but not least, and perhaps the most critical aspect of creating a stock count, I want to generate forms that I can utilize to walk around and record my stock count entries. Let's see what that looks like to actually create one from scratch. So I'm going to create, so a scenario might be that for whatever reason, I determined that a group of items across a range of sites need to be verified. Perhaps I've just taken responsibility for this area and I want to make sure as a new inventory manager that I'm starting out with a valid stock count. I'm going to create a stock count. And in this case, I'm going to give a description to identify when I actually created this stock count. So my system date is into the future, not based on the current date, so this gives me the option to make sure that all of my dates are valid. I'm not going to choose a default site ID because I'm not going to add items individually. I'm going to use the mass add feature to do that. Even though I'm doing this on a particular date, I have a feeling that I might need to do this particular stock count at some time in the future, so I'm going to leave my reuse stock count feature checked. Come down and use my mass add feature. And I want to select my item class. So I have an item class called attractive cordless phones. I'm going to use that as one of the selection criteria. Additionally, I'm not going to count these items in all sites. I'm going to limit it to a specific range of sites. So I'm going to select from the south site as well as from the warehouse. You notice when I selected that range, I quickly added items, and now I have a list of items that I can count at this particular site and warehouse. The next step, everything looks good. I have the items that I want to add. I'm going to actually start the count. When I start the count, the system is going to validate that this is indeed a valid stock count. So it's going to print my stock count exception list. And then the next thing I want to do is print my stock count forms. Print it to the screen. I have no exception. That's great. And now if I were processing this in a live environment, I have a set of forms that I can use to process my stock count again. I'm going to pause here for a moment. I'm going to open up the line, see if there's any questions. Any questions? Okay, let me pause for a moment. If you have any questions from anyone so far of what we've covered, of initiating, creating a stock count, checking for exceptions, and then printing the forms.
Not here.
Okay. All right. Let me switch back to my PowerPoint.
Dad?
Yes.
Will you be covering ABC codes at all?
I'll be able to answer some questions on how to generate an ABC code, but we weren't planning to actually cover the creation of one. But there's a wizard that allows you to do that. If we have some time at the end, we can certainly cover that.
Okay, thanks.
Any other questions? All right, let me switch back to my PowerPoint for a moment. Let's cover a few key points on this. So a few things to keep in mind when creating a stock count. Number one, when you're selecting items, if for some reason, depending upon how your items are named, you might not realize that you ended up selecting a kit or service or miscellaneous, or flat fee. Those are items that cannot be included on the stock count. So if you accidentally select those types of items, the system will provide you with an error message letting you know that you have an invalid item. It's possible, as I mentioned a little bit earlier, that perhaps other people in your organization are managing different sites, different items, and for some reason you end up with the same item site combination on the stock count that's already been initiated. If that happens, when you generate the stock count exception list, the system will notify you that there's already a count in progress for this site and item, and that you have a couple things to do, either remove that site item combination from your stock count or wait until the other individual completes their stock count. When you have a stock count and you need to make edits to the stock count, only make edits to a stock count schedule when the status is available. So you can add items, you can delete items, you can mass add items. This can only be done while you're in the available mode. If the stock count has already started, you'll have to wait until either you cancel the stock count and start all over, or when it's finished. And then one system aspect is that you cannot start a stock count if there are some system processes that are in progress. So, for example, there may be a reason that someone else in your organization is reconciling inventory quantities using the routine to reconcile inventory quantities. Or if there's a process in place changing the valuation, changing decimal places, or during close process, you cannot initiate a stock count at that time. And if you attempt to do that, the system will identify that the stock count cannot be started. So step one is creating the stock count schedule, printing the stock count form, actually going around and counting the items at a given site, bin, or location. The next step would be to actually come back and enter the result of the stock count. So that's done on the stock count entry window. It's here where you enter the physical count. We'll show this a little bit later, but if for some reason as you're entering the count, you realize that your variances are so far off that something must have happened when someone was conducting a physical count, you can actually cancel entering of the count, perhaps cancel the stock count, and start all over again, have the system recapture the quantities, and then conduct the count again. As you enter in the stock count result, the system will compute a variance based upon what the system says is on hand, compare that to what you've entered in as a stock count, and then it will use that variance to update the on-hand quantities in inventory, as well as updating the general ledger balances. And then if you establish a stock count frequency for an item site combination, then the system will actually increment that to the next scheduled stock count date based upon the item cycle frequency. Go back to GP and see what that looks like. Close this window. So I've started my stock count, and now I'm going to go over to my stock count window. Now, selecting a stock count to be utilized, it will only allow me to select a stock count that has a value of started. Done? Started one. Now it's time to come back and enter the quantity. On this window, you'll notice a couple things. Again, I can sort the scrolling area based upon site, item, bid number, description. Certainly to make the data entry easier, I would certainly like to make sure that the items as they appear in the scrolling window match the forms that I'm going to be getting back for my stock count. Document date in the upper right-hand corner, and that's the date that's going to be used to post the transactions in inventory and ultimately ledger. Notice there's an expansion button next to that window. I click on the expansion button. It will show me the current stock count date and time. It's going to default to when I actually started the count, but then likely that's not when the count took place. So perhaps I want to change this date to the 13th. Time was 10 a.m. And what this allows me to do is when I'm entering the result of my stock count, rather than entering the time and date multiple times, the system will utilize what I chose for the default. Right below that is a button called Auto Post Stock Count Variance. What this means is that when the variances are calculated, it will auto-post those variances directly into inventory. If that field is not selected, it will create an inventory batch, and then I would go to inventory batches or series posts for inventory and post the batch. Some organizations want to review that batch before it's posted. Others feel that as long as I've verified my stock count quantities, then rather than having a separate step of posting the batch, I don't have any other individuals that need to review batches. I'll just have it auto-post. We talked a little bit earlier about the reuse stock count. So again, if I have that button checked, once the stock count is completed, stock count will be available for me to utilize at a different time. Go down to the scrolling area, and this is where the item number, description, site, and bin are going to default. And then I would enter in my counted quantity. So from my sheets, I come over here and I actually enter in my counted quantities. When I tab off of that field, you'll notice that the verified box has been checked. Before I can actually process a stock count, all of the verified boxes are required to be checked. Again, this is just one additional opportunity for me to make sure that the quantities I entered are what I intended to enter. There may be cases where I store the inventory in one unit of measure, but for some reason I need to count it in another. So I store the inventory in eaches, but when I go to my specific location, they're stored in boxes or cases. So I don't want to have to manually do the unit of measure conversion. The system can do it for me. If I highlight my counted quantity, I select the expansion box next to unit of measure. From here, any valid unit of measure for that item can be used. But if I've already started the count on the other screen in the base unit of measure, I can't change it here. I'd have to select this first and then come back and do it. But again, this is just another way of allowing me to enter my item count. Talked a little bit about the counted date, the count time. The next field here is the captured This is a display-only field right under the date. So this is what the system recognized was captured at the time I started the count. It's a display-only field, and I cannot change it. Same as the on-hand quantity, display-only field, and I cannot change it. If I continue down, you'll notice that there's a variance quantity. The variance quantity is normally the difference between the captured quantity and the counted quantity. There are some exceptions to that. Let me show you the rules of what may happen. So I want to go back to my stock count entry window in the variance quantity. What are some exceptions as to when the count or counted quantity is different than the captured quantity? Primary reason why that might be a different value is if the available quantity is less than the variance. So what does that say? Here's an example. So my counted quantity is 15. My captured quantity is 25. That's going to give me a negative 10 variance. But if my available quantity is equal to 8, the system will only post a variance of minus 8. Simple reason, the system under normal circumstances does not want to drive the available quantity negative. So it's only going to reduce the available quantity by the amount that's present. Another scenario, the counted quantity is less than the captured quantity and the available quantity is equal to 0 or less than 0, meaning it's already negative. The system is going to set the variance to 0. Again, not going to drive the quantity less than 0 or more negative than it already is. There's an option that if for some reason you want to override that when you're setting up inventory, you can't allow the system to override that option, but as we all know, under normal circumstances, it's not a good situation to have negative inventory balances. Go back to, so as I continue on, I'll go and add a few more counts here. And for the sake of data entry, I'll just verify that there were no counts found for the remaining items. Now this is just about ready to process, but before I process it, I want to take a look at what general ledger entries are going to be made based upon this variance. I won't actually see the general ledger entry, but I will see the account that will be impacted. So if I click on my distribution tab, just like all the other windows in Dynamics GP, I'll notice that my inventory account, what account's going to be posted to, and what my variance account is. So if that isn't what I intended for this transaction, I have the opportunity to change it on this window. I also may have be having difficulty reconciling my variance. I've got a huge variance, and I was sure that I had an update to my inventory, some kind of receiving transaction, some kind of inventory adjustment transaction. What the unposted transaction allows me to do is take a look at any unposted transactions that are out there. So this will let me know, oh, okay, I see that this transaction wasn't posted yet. That's why I have such a large variance. And perhaps I'm the person that has responsibility for posting batches, so I could go out to that batch and post it. Or I could get in touch with the person that has that responsibility, and they can post the transaction. That's unposted. The transaction history is where I can display posted transactions. So something opposite may have happened, that I didn't realize that someone already posted a transaction Again, I'm trying to identify why I have such a huge variance between my counted quantity and my captured quantity. This window allows me to take a look at posted transactions. And again, I have quite a range of my document date that I want to take a look at. So again, all of that intended for allowing me to really see what's happening before I process this transaction. I'm going to go through, everything else looks good. Verify those counts. And then last, I'm going to process the transaction. Shows me the batch that's been created, shows me the number of the adjustment that's been created. And at that point, my stock count entry has been completed. So it's going to post my variances to inventory, the actual on-hand balances. It's going to update my general ledger. And now that's going to be reflected in my stock count. There's some additional things to keep in mind when you're doing this. So let's take a look at some of the hints when processing a stock count entry. So I talked earlier about not having to shut down your entire operation when you're conducting a stock count. And the reason for that is that if transactions, they can still be posted once the stock count has started. And if these transactions are posted, then the on-hand quantity field is updated. So the system can keep processing. Talked a little bit about the document date. That actually becomes the posting date. And therefore, if you change the document date, it will reset the posting date. So that's certainly something you want to keep in mind depending upon when you're conducting the inventory, whether it's at the close of a fiscal period or close of a year, that you want to make sure that the document date and posting date are reflective of the period you want this transaction to be posted in. Talked about the counted quantity. There's two ways of entering the counted quantity. Normally, it's going to default to the base unit of measure. But if for some reason you want to enter the counted quantity in a unit of measure different than the base unit of measure, that's where you do it on the stock count unit of measure entry window. If you started on that window, then you have to make all of the changes on that window. When we were going over the variance computation, I mentioned that the system, under normal circumstances, does not want you to drive the inventory balance negative, but if based upon your business rules and objectives that you have a need to allow the inventory balance to be driven negative, under the inventory control setup window, there's a field called Allow Variance Override, and again, that will allow you to, whatever the variance is computed at, even if it's greater than the available quantity, the system will use that to post the variance. And I mentioned that all lines have to be verified before the processing the stock count. So the key thing on that is as you're actually entering in the stock count values, the system is going to default that the line has been verified. If you go to a site for a particular item and there are 0 balances there, so there's nothing to enter in, and you want that 0 quantity to be reflected, then you do have to enter or check the box that it's been verified. Let me show you one additional thing on stock count. You can also have a stock count of, you might have items that are lot tracked. So rather than just simply, I have a stock count here and these items have been identified as for lot tracking. So rather than just entering the gross stock count, I perhaps need to actually enter by lot what I found. So maybe I'm going to enter here. And if I select down the bottom, serial or lot, I would actually select the lot that's associated with the 100. And I can add lots, I can delete lots, and this gives me the ability to take my stock count to a more finite level. So this example is for lot. You have items that you're also tracking serial numbers on. You can actually identify the specific serial numbers that you've found as well. So as you can see, it's a pretty powerful aspect of being able to capture and count items. So some frequently asked questions when performing a stock count. So maybe rather than just having an ad hoc stock counting process on the item site combination, you're actually going to set up a stock count frequency. And then as you process the stock count, the system will calculate when the next count is due. But then there are times where there are days that you want to be excluded from that cycle. Maybe there are holidays or maybe weekends that you don't want included in that. So when you set up the stock count calendar, under setup inventory stock count, you can mark days as down days, and the system will exclude that when calculating the next stock count interval. Another question that's come up is, I would like to print a summarized report that lists all of my stock count schedules. Is that possible? Well, there's not a report out of the box that allows you to do that, but you can generate a custom report using the report writer tool, looking at the stock count table, stores the stock count as well as the stock count schedule. And that's one way to do it. Or perhaps if you have someone that's familiar with writing reports and SQL Server reporting services, you can generate a report there as well. And then last but not least, it's worth covering another time, is that sometimes when people don't realize that the variance quantity is dependent upon the available quantity, a question comes up when I tab off the field, the variance quantity is not being calculated by taking the counted quantity minus the captured quantity Y. And again, the system is taking a look at what you have for available quantity and will not allow you to drive it negative. So certainly when you look at the process of creating the stock count, printing the forms, and coming back to enter the entered quantity, it certainly is a pretty straightforward process. Anything we had one question earlier about seeing the wizard for ABC. Is there anything, any other questions or things you were thinking that you would see but did not get a chance to see or were expecting to see out of this session?
Is there any way to automate the entry? You know, you've done data entry. Is there any way you can automate the import of that?
Okay, so rather than keying the data in, maybe through Integration Manager or eConnect to import the data.
Hey Chaz, this is Clinton. There are tools that work with GP to handle stock counts from Accelos, which if you're using barcodes in the warehouse, and that data will actually import into GP.
Thank you.
Any other questions?
Is there similar capabilities for counting fixed assets?
Not not in the sense that the system's going to capture quantity. So maybe you can elaborate. Give me an example of what you'd be looking to do.
Well, we need to provide in our audit every year that we have accounted for all of our fixed assets. And I was hoping there was some sort of cycle count mechanism for that as well.
So with fixed assets, you had the option to do reports on your fixed assets for your inventory on assets. You can do those by your property locations on your assets or reports in fixed assets for doing that, as well as some pretty easy smart lists for doing that as well, for doing the counts on your fixed assets for doing that annually.
So there's really nothing in place where we have a report similar to what we get after the end of our inventory count.
It's not quite the same, but we can, if you'll shoot an email, we can send you some additional details on that.
Thank you.
Okay. Any other questions? So the last thing I'll cover, although it's not actually a part of the stock count process, but certainly can be utilized to make a determination on the items that you want to count, is item ABC analysis. So again, this is an ability that you want to either count the high value item or items with a high frequency, whatever mechanism that you want to utilize to classify your items. So there's a routine within inventory. So again, I'm on the inventory area page under routine. It's called the item ABC analysis. And literally, this is a wizard that walks you through how you set up your ABC analysis. So we'll just quickly walk through. So what are some of the options that I want to choose? It's the value. So maybe I want to classify my items by, what are high value items, and I want to make sure that I'm doing a stock count based upon that. Or maybe it's quantity. How quickly am I consuming these items so that I make sure I keep on hand the correct quantity. Or maybe it's really just looking at the unit cost. Maybe I never keep a high volume of these, but the unit cost is so high, I want to make sure that I periodically utilize that. And so then as I continue walking through this, it allows me to say, well, how do I want to set the ABC code if there's none of that on hand? And then how do I treat the usage, whether it's a negative quantity or zero? So. And am I looking at the calendar periods or the fiscal period? And again, you just keep walking through the calculation, the wizard, depending upon what's important for your organization. And then this is where I guess the value comes in. So maybe that's going to be my 80. Run a preview on it, and then I would actually go through and complete the wizard using my ABC analysis. And then you notice when I was creating my stock count schedule and I was adding mass items to my stock count, one of the selection criteria was the ABC analysis. So again, as I mentioned, this is, although it's not required to use for stock count, it certainly can add ease of use in selecting what items you want to include in a stock count schedule. So certainly, I would encourage you that in your perhaps test environment to take a look at this item analysis code, process it through the wizard, see how it groups the items if it's the manner that you expect, and then you could actually roll that into your production environment and use it for your stock counting process. Does that answer your question on how you might utilize the item ABC analysis to create it and then go back and use it on a stock count?
Yeah, for the most part, thank you.
Okay. We have a few minutes left, although we're coming down to the end of our scheduled time. So I guess perhaps the easiest way to get back in touch with us, if there are any follow-up questions that you might even think of once we finish the webinar that You know, oftentimes as soon as you hang up, the question comes to mind. It's like, oh, wow, I wish I asked that question. What do I do? If you send it to this email, then we'll make sure that we get back to you with the information that you're requesting.